Hello, everyone, and good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Archival Discourses. Tonight, I'm going to be reading and talking about the Arabic 14th century scholar Ibn Khaldun and his concept of Asabiyyah. And for those who aren't aware, Khaldun, he was this historian and sociologist in the 14th century. He was from North Africa, modern-day Tunisia, and he had a quite a long career as a historian in the Islamic world. And his best known work is his Muqammada, or his introduction to history. It was intended as a introduction to a longer work of the history of the world. However, he was incomplete when he died, and only this introductory section was actually done. And so in it, he's mostly giving a basic introduction to the history and nature of human society, with obviously a strong focus on the Middle East and North Africa. And one of the key concepts he talks about in the Muqammada is Asabiyyah. Transliterated into English, this roughly translates to either a group feeling or social cohesion. And now, this is ultimately, in his view, the kind of the solidarity or the glue that holds a people together, whether it's like an Arabic tribe or clan, like the Bedouin, for example, or the Berbers, and how they're able to build a civilization or a culture, and then ultimately how over the generations the Asabiyyah breaks down, and they're leading to decadence and the rise of either another empire or another people. And most famous example is this: if we're talking about the Arabs, you've got the Prophet Muhammad unifies the Arabs under Islam, and then you have the Rashidun Caliphate who launches the great Arab conquests against the Sassanids and the Byzantines. Have the Umayyads come in, they institute more conquests. The Abbasids then come in, and they sort of they stabilize things for a time, and there's a great flourishing of culture. But ultimately, that initial drive, that initial spark is sort of gone by the time you get 100 years into the Abbasids, and then the empire starts to slowly fragment and disintegrate. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up a PDF I've got, and I'm going to do some reading and discussing. So we're going to start with what is book 2 of the Muqammada. I should note that I'm reading from an abridgment. So in terms of translation to English, there's only really one of the Muqammada you can get, which was done in 1958 by the Orientalist scholar Franz Rosenthal. So there's a 3-volume edition, which is with Princeton University Press. What I'm reading from is an abridgment of that Rosenthal translation. So I think it's a very good introduction to the thought of Ibn Khaldun. So, Bedouin civilization, savage nations and tribes and their conditions of life, including several basic and explanatory statements. So, 1. Both Bedouins and sedentary people are natural groups. It should be known that differences of condition among people are a result of the different ways in which they make their living. Social organization enables them to cooperate toward that end and to start with the simple necessities of life before they get to conveniences and luxuries. Some people live by agriculture, the cultivation of vegetables and grains, others by animal husbandry, the use of sheep, cattle, goats, bees, and silkworms for breeding and for their products. Those who live by agriculture or animal husbandry cannot avoid the call of the desert because it alone offers the wide fields, pastures for animals, and other things that the settled areas do not offer. It is therefore necessary for them to restrict themselves to the desert. Their social organization and cooperation for the needs of life and civilization, such as food, shelter, and warmth, do not take them beyond their bare subsistence level because of their inability to provide for anything beyond those things. Subsequent improvement of their conditions and acquisition of more wealth and comfort than they need cause them to rest and take it easy. Then they cooperate for things beyond their bare necessities. They use more food and clothes and take pride in them. They build large houses and lay out towns and cities for protection. This is followed by an increase in comfort and ease, which leads to formation of the most developed luxury customs. They take the greatest pride in the preparation of food and fine cuisine, in the use of varied splendid clothes of silk and brocade and other fine materials. in the construction of ever higher buildings and towers, in elaborate furnishings for the buildings, and the most intensive cultivation of crafts in actuality. They build castles and mansions, provide them with running water, build their towers higher and higher, and compete in furnishing them most elaborately. They differ in the quality of the clothes, the beds, the vessels, and the utensils they employ for their purposes. Sedentary people means the inhabitants of cities and countries, some of whom adopt the crafts as their way of making a living, while others adopt commerce. They earn more and live more comfortably than Bedouins because they live on a level beyond the level of bare necessity, and their way of making a living corresponds to their wealth. It has thus become clear that Bedouins and sedentary people are natural groups which exist by necessity, as we have stated. And so here what he's getting into is one of the first things you see that can lead to a breakdown in Asabiyyah is you have the people like the Arabs who go from living in the desert where it's very subsistence, you've got to hunt or scavenge for what you eat. And then when they conquer places like the Levant where there's an urban culture, you've got the cities of Phoenicia and Syria, they then settle down and they start to adopt the life of like a merchant or something, and then by that point you're not growing your own or scavenging for your own food, you're just you're this wealthy merchant and you're buying your food. So again, there's a less strenuous lifestyle, but it leads you to become soft and fat ultimately. And just got a couple of questions from Michael Hasler. By the way, have you heard or read Nikolai Ilyich Leontiev? I know a bit off topic, but very quickly, yes, I believe someone brought him to my attention on Twitter the other day. I've not heard of him before, no, but from what if it's the person I'm thinking of, then yes, it was quite interesting what was recommended to me. And I've heard Niccolo Machiavelli was inspired by Ibn Khaldun. That I have not heard of before. But that would be interesting if he was. I'd have to look into that. Right. Let's move on. So, part 2. The Bedouins are a natural group in the world. We've mentioned in the previous section that the inhabitants of the desert adopt the natural manner of making a living, namely agriculture and animal husbandry. They restrict themselves to the necessity in food, clothing, and mode of dwelling, and to the other necessary conditions and customs. They do not possess conveniences and luxuries. They use tents of hair and wool, or houses of wood, or of clay and stone, which are not furnished elaborately. The purpose is to have shade and shelter, nothing beyond that. They also take shelter in caverns and caves. The food they take is either little prepared or not prepared at all, save that it may have been touched by fire. For those who make their living through the cultivation of grain, through agriculture, it is better to be stationary than to travel around. Such, therefore, are the inhabitants of small communities, villages, and mountain regions. These people make up the large mass of the Berbers and non-Bedouins. Those who make their living from animals requiring pasturage, such as sheep and cattle, usually travel around in order to find pasture and water for their animals, since it is better for them to move around in the land. They are called sheepmen, that is, men who live on sheep and cattle. They do not go deep into the desert because they would not find good pastures there. Such people include the Berbers, the Turks, the Turkomans, and Slavs, for instance. Those who make their living by raising camels and move around more, they wander deeper into the desert because their hilly pastures with their plants and shrubs do not furnish enough subsistence for camels. They must feed on the desert shrubs and drink their salty desert water. They must move around the desert regions during the winter, in flight from the harmful cold to the warm desert air. In the desert sands, camels can find places to give birth to their young ones. Of all animals, camels have the hardest livery and the greatest need for warmth and connection with it. Camel nomads are therefore forced to make excursions deep into the desert. Frequently, too, they are driven from the hills by the militia, and they penetrate farther into the desert because they do not want the militia to mete out justice to them or to punish them for their hostile acts. As a result, they are the most savage human beings that exist. Compared with sedentary people, they are on a level with wild, untamable animals, dumb beasts of prey. Such people are the Bedouins. In the west, the nomadic Berbers and the Zanatar are their counterparts in the east, the Kurds, the Turkomans, and the Turks. The Bedouins, however, make deeper excursions into the desert and are more rooted in desert life because they live exclusively on camels, while the other groups live on sheep and cattle as well as camels. It has thus become clear that the Bedouins are a natural group which by necessity exists in civilization. So 3. Bedouins are prior to sedentary people. The desert is the basis and reservoir of civilization and cities. We mentioned that the Bedouins restrict themselves to the bare necessities in their way of life and are unable to go beyond them, while sedentary people concern themselves with conveniences and luxuries in their conditions and customs. The bare necessities are no doubt prior to the conveniences and luxuries. Bare necessities, in a way, are basic and luxury secondary. Bedouins, thus, are the basis of and prior to cities and sedentary people. Man seeks first the bare necessities. Only after he has obtained the bare necessities does he get to comforts and luxuries. The toughness of desert life precedes the softness of sedentary life. Therefore, urbanization is found to be the goal in which the Bedouin aspires. Through his own efforts, he achieves what he proposes to achieve in this respect. When he has obtained enough to be ready for the conditions and the customs of luxury, he enters upon a life of ease and submits himself to the yoke of the city. This is the case of all Bedouin tribes. Sedentary people, on the other hand, have no desire for desert conditions, unless they are motivated by some urgent necessity or they cannot keep up with their fellow city dwellers. Evidence of the fact that Bedouins are the basis of and prior to sedentary people is furnished by investigating the inhabitants of any given city, which will find that most of its inhabitants originated among Bedouins dwelling in the country and villages of their vicinity. Such Bedouins became wealthy, settled in the city, adopted a life of ease and luxury such as exists in the sedentary environment. All Bedouins and sedentary people differ also among themselves in their conditions of life. Many a clan is greater than another, many a tribe greater than another, many a city larger than another, many a town more populous than another. Got a good note here from my friend Hunger the Dye Merchant. There should be a distinction between Bedouins and pastoralists, though there is an overlap. I agree with you because fundamentally, pastoralists are much more nomadic. So, for example, the Turks, as he's mentioned there, you find them, from Anatolia, Iran, and even into Central Asia. Whereas the Arabs, if we're talking ethnically, only really the Arabian Peninsula are pure Arabs. Most of the other peoples you find in like the Levant, Mesopotamia, and North Africa, they're all other peoples who have just been assimilated in Arabic culture and language fundamentally. So there's much less of a genetic footprint in those areas compared to areas that have been conquered or settled by Turks or Turkomans. And another interesting thought, this idea that urban or what you call sedentary civilization is softening and leads to a decline in civilization. I very much see a lot of that in the modern West because ultimately, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, you have a much greater urban concentration of the population in cities. And then as a result, we have the modern West we live in today where, the Asabiyyah of our people now, as deracinated as they are, is not as strong as it once was prior to the Industrial Revolution. I think, it's very radical that Ibn Khaldun's been able to spot this, centuries ago. For Bedouins are closer to being good than sedentary people. The reason for this is that the soul, in its first natural state of creation, is ready to accept whatever good or evil may arrive and leave an imprint upon it. Muhammad said, "Every infant is born in the natural state. It is in his parents to make him a Jew or a Christian or a heathen. To the degree the soul is first affected by one of the two qualities, it moves away from the other and finds it difficult to acquire it. When customs proper to goodness have been first to enter the soul of a good person, and his soul has thus acquired the habit of goodness, that person moves away from evil and finds it difficult to do anything evil. The same applies to the evil person. Sedentary people are much concerned with all kinds of pleasures. They are accustomed to luxury and success in worldly occupations and to indulgence in worldly desires. Therefore, their souls are coloured with all the kinds of blameworthy and evil qualities. The more of them they possess, the more remote do the ways and means of goodness become to them. Eventually, they lose all sense of restraint. Many of them are found to use improper language in their gatherings, as well as in the presence of their superiors and womenfolk. They're not deterred by any sense of restraint. Because the bad custom of behaving openly in the improper manner, in both words and deeds, has taken hold of them, Bedouins may be as concerned with worldly affairs as sedentary people are. However, such concern would touch only the necessities of life and not luxuries or anything causing or calling for desires and pleasures. The customs they follow in their mutual dealings are, therefore, appropriate. As compared with those of sedentary people, their evil ways and blameworthy qualities are much less numerous. They are closer to the first natural state and more remote from the evil habits that have been impressed upon the souls of sedentary people through numerous and ugly blameworthy customs. Thus, they can more easily be cured than sedentary people. That is obvious. It will later on become clear that sedentary life constitutes the last stage of civilization and the point where it begins to decay. It also constitutes the last stage of evil and of remoteness and goodness. Clearly, the Bedouins are closer to being good than sedentary people. And just a comment on the language, this might be an issue with the translation, but when he's talking about good and evil, I don't think he's necessarily meaning like moral good or evil. I think he's more talking in a religious sense of the words, where good, as in you are closer to God or to true faith and religion, whereas in a sedentary or urban environment, you become a lot more lax in your, you're closest to religion. There are far more atheists nowadays, non-modern urban West, than there were centuries ago. So again, I think that's an important distinction to make with the commentary he's making here. 5. The Bedouins are more disposed to courage than sedentary people. The reason for this is that sedentary people have become used to laziness and ease. They're sunk in well-being and luxury. They have entrusted the defence of their property and their lives to the governor, a ruler who rules them, and to the militia which has the task of guarding them. They find full assurance of safety in the walls that surround them and the fortifications that protect them. No noise disturbs them, and no hunting occupies their time. They are carefree and trusting, and have ceased to carry weapons. Successive generations have grown up in this way of life. They have become like women and children who depend upon the master of the house. Eventually, this has come to be a quality of character that replaces natural disposition. The Bedouins, on the other hand, live apart from the community. They are alone in the country and remote from militias. They have no walls or gates, therefore they provide their own defence and do not entrust it to or rely upon others for it. They always carry weapons. They watch carefully all sides of the road. They take hurried naps only when they are together in company or when they are in the saddle. They pay attention to the most distant barking or noise. They go alone into the desert, guided by their fortitude, putting their trust in themselves. Fortitude has become a character quality of theirs, encouraged their nature. They use it whenever they are called upon or roused by an alarm. When sedentary people mix with them in the desert or associate with them on the journey, they depend on them. They cannot do anything for themselves without them. This is an observed fact. Their dependence extends even to knowledge of the country, the directions, watering places, and crossroads. Man is a child of the customs and the things he has become used to. He is not the product of his natural disposition and temperament. The conditions into which he has become accustomed until they have become for him a quality of character and matters of habit and custom have replaced his natural disposition. If one studies this in human beings, one will find much of it, and it will be found to be a correct observation. Yes, so again, ultimately, the Bedouin, as I mentioned with Muhammad, under these this great moral religious desert people are able to go out and conquer the whole Middle East and North Africa, and even push up the borders of India, and other peoples like the West, for example. I think especially from the time of the early modern period post 1492, this great the Spanish, because it's very interesting because Arnold Toynbee has this idea that why were the Spanish and Portuguese able to extend themselves so much over the globe in the early modern period, and it's because they spent centuries fighting the Reconquista against the Arab Muslims in Iberia, and so again they have their own kind of sort of crusading Asabiyyah, which then they still had by the time they drove the Muslims out, which then propelled them to then conquer these vast, great globe-spanning empires. And there's just a comment here from Hunger again. Haram and halal, I'm sure, is what's being translated. Yes, that's probably quite a good point. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so part 6. The reliance of sedentary people upon laws destroys their fortitude and power of resistance. Not everyone is master of his own affairs. Chiefs and leaders who are masters of their affairs of men are few in comparison with the rest. As a rule, man must by necessity be dominated by someone else. If the domination is kind and just, then people under it are not oppressed by its laws and restrictions. They are guided by the courage or cowardice that they possess in themselves. They are satisfied with the absence of any restraining power. Self-reliance eventually becomes a quality natural to them. They would not know anything else. If, however, the domination with its laws is one of the brute force and intimidation, it breaks their fortitude and deprives them of their power of resistance as a result of their inertness that develops in the souls of the oppressed, as we shall explain. When laws are enforced by means of punishment, they completely destroy fortitude, because the use of punishment against someone who cannot defend himself generates in that person a feeling of humiliation that no doubt must break his fortitude. When laws are intended to serve the purposes of education and instruction and are applied from childhood on, they have to some degree the same effect, because people then grow up in fear and docility, and consequently they do not rely on their own fortitude. Thus, great fortitude is found among the savage Arab Bedouins than among people who are subject to laws. Furthermore, those who rely on laws and are dominated by them from the very beginning of their education and instruction in the crafts, sciences, and religious matters are thereby deprived of much of their own fortitude. They can scarcely defend themselves at all against hostile acts. This is the case with students, whose occupation it is to study and learn from teachers and religious leaders, and who constantly apply themselves to instruction and education in very dignified gatherings. This situation and the fact that it destroys the power of resistance and fortitude must be understood. It is no argument that the men around Muhammad observed their religious laws and yet did not experience any diminution of their fortitude, but possessed the greatest possible fortitude. When the Muslims got their religion from Muhammad, the restraining influence came from themselves as a result of their encouragement and their discouragement he gave them in the Quran. It was not a result of technical instruction or scientific education. The laws were the laws and precepts of the religion that they received orally, and which their firmly rooted belief in the truth of the articles of faith caused them to observe. Their fortitude remained unabated, and it was not corroded by education or authority. Umar said, "Those who are not disciplined by the religious law are not educated by God." Umar's desire was that everyone should have his restraining influence in himself. His certainty was that Muhammad knew best what is good for mankind. I should comment, when he says Umar, I believe he's referring to Umar ibn al-Khattab, who was the second Islamic caliph after Muhammad, and who the vast bulk of those early conquests were done under. Clearly then, governmental and educational laws destroy fortitude, because their restraining influence is something that comes from outside. The religious laws, on the other hand, do not destroy fortitude, because their restraining influence is something inherent. Therefore, governmental and educational laws influence sedentary people, and that they weaken their souls and diminish their stamina, because they have to suffer them both as children and as adults. The Bedouins, on the other hand, are not in the same position, because they live far away from the laws of government, instruction, and education. And again, I see this is something today, and where ultimately, back in the medieval period, you have a lot of what is called private justice. You'd often have to take an affront against you or your family into your own hands. If your daughter's sexually assaulted and raped, you'd often have to hunt down the villain yourself, and kill him or hang him. That's one example. And I'm thinking back to because one thing that's very similar between the Anglo-Saxons and the Arabs is they're both they love a good feud, and so you see this today, and though to a lesser extent in the Arab countries of the Arabian Peninsula, this idea of the blood feud, where even today there's great deals to try and avoid any kind of conflict, because if you, as an Arab man, if your daughter is raped or sexually assaulted by another man, you are obliged to kill and seek vengeance. And this was something that was even in a lot of these Germanic cultures, such as the Anglo-Saxons. The idea of the feud or resolving a private grievance. But today, where we've got national police services everywhere, everybody just lets the police get on with it, and that's even become more damaging, because the police don't necessarily have our best interests at heart, if you know what I'm getting at. A comment from Michael Hassler. So Ibn Khaldun is essential. I think it's urban, slowly becoming less religious. What about the suburbs? They exist in the middle ground between rural and urban. Well, ultimately, I think the suburbs are pretty much a invention of modernity and Michael Hasler. So that's one element of that. And secondly, if I'm being honest, I would probably put the suburbs as part of what he calls sedentary civilization, rather than desert or rural civilization, because yes, they're not quite as urbanized as the proper urban city center. They're still somewhat urbanized. I can still see the laxity of morals and the comfort fundamentally. 7. Only tribes held together by group feeling can live in the desert. It should be known that God put good and evil into the nature of man. Thus he says in the Quran, "We led him along the two paths." He further says, and inspire the soul with wickedness as well as fear of God. Evil is the quality that is closest to man when he fails to improve his customs and when religion is not used as a model to improve him. The great mass of mankind is in that condition, with the exception of those to whom God gives success. Evil qualities in man are injustice and mutual aggression. He who casts his eye upon the property of his brother will lay his hand upon it and take it, unless there is a restraining influence to hold him back, the poet thus says. Injustice is a human trait. If you find a moral man, there is some reason why he's not unjust. Mutual aggression of people in towns and cities is averted by the authorities, and the government, which hold back the masses under their control from attacks and aggression upon each other, they are thus prevented by the influence of force and governmental authority from mutual injustice, save such injustice as comes from the ruler himself. Aggression against a city from outside may be averted by walls in the event of unpreparedness, a surprise attack at night, or inability of the inhabitants to withstand the enemy during the day, or it may be averted with the help of the government auxiliary troops, if the inhabitants are prepared and ready to offer resistance. The restraining influence among Bedouin tribes comes from their sheikhs and leaders. It results from their great respect and veneration they generally enjoy among the people. The hamlets of the Bedouins are defended against outside enemies by a tribal militia composed of noble youths of the tribe who are known for their courage. Their defense and protection are successful only if they are a closely knit group of common descent. This strengthens their stamina and makes them feared, since everybody's affection for his family and his group is more important than anything else. Compassion and affection for one's own blood relations and its relatives exist in human nature as something God puts into the hearts of men. It makes for mutual support and aid and increases the fear felt by the enemy. Yeah, so ultimately, as you see that, because the desert is such a harsh and fierce environment, only very hard people can actually survive and live in such an environment. And just to continue, those who have none of their own lineage to care for rarely feel affection for their fellows. If danger is in the air on the day of battle, such as a man sinks away and seeks to save himself because he is afraid of being left without support, such people therefore cannot live in the desert because they would fall prey to any nation that might want to swallow them up. If this is true with regard to the place where one lives, which is in constant need of defence and military protection, it is equally true with regard to every other human activity, such as prophecy, the establishment of royal authority, or propaganda. Nothing can be achieved in these matters without fighting for it, since man has the natural urge to offer resistance, and for fighting one cannot do without group feeling, as we had mentioned at the beginning. Okay, next we've got section 8. Group feeling results only from blood relationship or something corresponding to it. Respect for blood ties is something natural among men, with the rarest exceptions. It leads to affection for one's relations and blood relatives, the feeling that no harm ought to befall them, nor any destruction come upon them. One feels shame when one's relatives are treated unjustly or attacked, and one wishes to intervene between them and whatever peril or destruction threatens them. This is a natural urge in man, for as long as there has been human beings, if the direct relationship between persons who help each other is very close, so that it leads to close contact and unity. The ties are obvious and clearly require the existence of a feeling of solidarity without any outside prodding. If, however, the relationship is somewhat distant, it is often forgotten in part. However, some knowledge of it remains, and this causes the person to help his relatives for the known motive, in order to escape the shame he would feel in his soul, were a person to whom he is somehow related treated unjustly. Clients and allies belong in the same category. The affection everybody has for his clients and allies results in the feeling of shame that comes to a person when one of his neighbours, relatives, or blood relation in any degree is humiliated. The result for it is that a client-master relationship leads to close contact exactly or approximately in the same way as does common descent. It is in that sense that one must understand Muhammad's remark, learn as much of your pedigrees as is necessary to establish your ties of kindred. It means that pedigrees are useful only insofar as they imply the close contact that is a consequence of blood ties and that eventually leads to mutual help and affection. Anything beyond that is superfluous, for a pedigree is something imaginary and devoid of reality. Its usefulness consists only in the resulting connection and close contact. If the fact of common descent is obvious and clear, it evokes in man a natural affection, as we have said. If, however, its existence is known only from remote history, it moves the imagination but faintly. Its usefulness is gone, and preoccupation with it becomes gratuitous, a kind of game, and as such is not permissible. In this sense, one must understand the remark, genealogy is something which is of no use to know, which it does no harm not to know. This means that when common descent is no longer clear and has become a matter of scientific knowledge, it can no longer move the imagination and is denied the affection caused by group feeling. It's become useless. I think this is a very interesting passage because fundamentally what he's saying is that the foundation of all sort of group feeling is that it's sort of a hierarchy. First is your own immediate family, then it's your clan or your tribe, and then it's your nation, or maybe the people you share a religion with. And so ultimately, as these things scale up, I think it's easier for Asabiyyah to break down because you have less of a connection with people who are part of your nation or religious group than you do, say, your own family. Because I think even if you look at today, I still think these kinship ties of Asabiyyah amongst your own family are still the only thing that has any kind of strength left. As deracinated as modern man is, people I still think are not going to sell out their own family as much as they're prepared to sell out their own nation. And so about half hour in, so I think that's enough from this section. I want to jump forward now to a future section, which is in chapter 3, where he is talking about what's this called? On dynasties, royal authority, the caliphate, government ranks, and all that goes with these things. The chapter contains basic and supplementary propositions. So in this one, he's mostly looking at the nature of royal dynasties and government authority and how Asabiyyah was related to these things. And so that's another aspect of the Muhammadan. As he's going through the book, he's scaling up. So he's starting with the very basics of civilization, the men living in the desert or the rural environment. Then he sort of goes up to establishing kingdoms and empires and a sedentary civilization, and then all the things that come out of that. Things like science, technology, commerce, and so that's sort of how the whole flow of the book goes. 1. Royal authority and large-scale dynastic power are attained only through a group and a group feeling. This is because aggressive and defensive strength is attained only through group feeling, which means affection and willingness to fight and die for each other. Now, royal authority is a noble and enjoyable position. It comprises all the good things of the world, the pleasures of the body, and the joys of the soul. Therefore, there is, as a rule, great competition for it. It rarely is handed over voluntarily, but it must be taken away. Thus, discord ensues. It leads to war and fighting and to attempts to gain superiority. Nothing of all this comes about except through group feeling, as we have also mentioned. This situation is not at all understood by the great mass. They forget it because they have forgotten the time when the dynasty first became established. They have grown up in settled areas for a long time. They have lived there for successive generations. Thus, they know nothing about what took place with God's help at the beginning of the dynasty. They merely notice that the colouring of the men of the dynasty is determined, that people have submitted to them, and that group feeling is no longer needed to establish their power. They do not know how it was at the beginning and what difficulties had to be overcome by the founder. The inhabitants of Spain especially have forgotten group feeling and its influence because so long a time has passed, and because, as a rule, they have no need of the power of group feeling, since the country has been annihilated and is depleted of tribal groups. So again, fundamentally, order to found a kind of a dynasty or a kingdom, there has to be a tribal group or organization for which to base your power upon. So with the Arabs, ultimately, after the demise of the Rashidun Caliphate, you have the rise of the Umayyads and the Abbasids, these specific clans of lineage from the family of the Prophet Muhammad, or specifically the Quraysh, the clan to which Muhammad belonged. So the Umayyads were descended from the Beni Umayyah, or descendants of the Abu Sufyan, whereas the Abbasids were descended from Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet, and they were part of the Beni Hashim, this rival clan within the Quraysh. And got a comment from Nathan C.J. Hood. Blood bonds are the fire of civilization. Yes, absolutely agree with you there, and Nathan C.J. Hood. Very nice to see you stop by on the stream. Right. And next, when a dynasty is firmly established, it can dispense with group feeling. The reason for this is that people find it difficult to submit to general dynastic power at the beginning unless they are forced into submission by strong superiority. The new government is something strange. People are not familiar with or used to its rule, but once leadership is firmly vested in the members of the family qualified to exercise royal authority in the dynasty, and once royal authority has been passed on by inheritance over many generations and through successive dynasties, the beginnings are forgotten and the members of that family are clearly marked as leaders. It has become a firmly established article of faith that one must be subservient and submissive to them. People will fight with them in their on their behalf, as they would fight for their articles of faith. By this time, the rulers will not need much group feeling to maintain their power. It is as if obedience to the government were a divinely revealed book that cannot be changed or opposed. The rulers maintain their hold over the government and their own dynasty with their help. They're either of clients and followers who grew up in the shadow and power of group feeling, or of tribal groups of a different descent who have become their clients. Something of the sort happened to the Abbasids. The group feeling of the Arabs had been destroyed by the time of the reign of Al-Mutasim and his son Al-Wathiq. They tried to maintain their hold over the government thereafter with the help of the Persian, Turkish, Daylam, and Seljuk and other clients. Then the non-Arabs and their clients gained power over the provinces of the realm. The influence of the dynasty grew smaller and no longer extended beyond the environment of Baghdad. Eventually, the Daylam enclosed in upon and took possession of that area. The caliphs were ruled by them. Then the Daylam in turn lost control. The Seljuks seized power after the Daylam, and the caliphs were ruled by them. Then the Seljuks in turn lost control. Finally, the Tatars closed in. They killed the caliph and wiped out every vestige of the dynasty. So just to clarify, so we're talking here about the decline of the Abbasids. So ultimately what happens there, Al-Mutasim was one of the caliphs that came in about 70 to 80 years after they had overthrown the Umayyads, and by this point the kinship ties had broken down, because the Umayyads beforehand had very strong ties to the Arabs and very much hierarchically structured their government on Arab lineage. So in order to have a high position at court, you had to have be a pure-blooded Arab. When they were overthrown and the Abbasids come in, because a lot of their support comes from the Persian or provinces, specifically of Khorasan in northeastern Iran, they rely heavily on a lot of Persian sort of bureaucrats and administrators in the court, along with Arabs. And then when you get to the later Abbasids, these ties break down even more. And as you mentioned, they then bring in these Turkish gulams, or these sort of slave soldiers, to fight for them. So, by this point, they've completely become so deracinated from the original stock that are relying on foreigners to do their fighting for them. And all this leads to is in 861, the Caliph Al-Muwatakil is executed and overthrown by his Turkish bodyguards, which leads to this grand decade-long civil war called the Anarchy at Samarra, which leads to the long-term decline and disintegration of the Abbasid Caliphate. And looking at some of these other terms, the Daylam. So the Daylam is a region in northern Iran, near the Caspian. When he's talking about the Daylam taking over, I believe he's talking about the Buyid dynasty, which were a Persian dynasty that would eventually vassalize the caliphs and rule Western Iran and Iraq. And then the Seljuks are these this tribe dynasty of Turks in Central Asia that would eventually conquer all of Iran, Iraq, and most of the rest of the Middle East. But what's also interesting is Ibn Khaldun has this belief that with Asabiyyah, generally speaking, with a dynasty, it lasts about 100 years and then things start going to pot. And it's true, each of these dynasties or empires have about 100 years where things are going well. And when you get to the 100-year mark, that's where things really start going wrong. So no, it seems to be this very strange, persistent rule, especially when you're looking at Islamic cultures. Another comment from Nathan C.J. Hood. I mean, this is a good explanation of present policy surrounding immigration. It is a power move over the original stock by the ruling elite to maintain power. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, ultimately, as academic Adrian likes to say, in a healthy society, there is a moral unity between the people and the elites. Any sense of Asabiyyah between the people and the elites has broken down, and now this is why they're just, plunging in all these immigrant groups into our countries. And what's even worse is these immigrant groups have a stronger sense of Asabiyyah to our own people, which is what is leading them to be such a dangerous threat, especially when you look at the so-called grooming gangs in various cities in Britain. The same happened to the Umayyad dynasty in Spain. When its Arab group feeling was destroyed, small princes seized power and divided the territory among themselves. In competition with each other, they distributed among themselves the realm of the Umayyad dynasty. Each one of them seized the territory under his control and aggrandized himself. These rulers learned of their relations that existed between the non-Arabs in the east and the Abbasids, imitating them. They adopted royal surnames and used royal trappings, there was no danger that anyone would take the prerogatives they claimed away from them or alter the situation in this respect, because Spain was no longer the home of groups and tribes. They tried to maintain their power with the help of clients and followers with that of the Zanata and other Berber tribes which had infiltrated Spain from the African shore. They imitated the way the Umayyad dynasty in its last stages had tried to maintain its power with their help. These newcomers founded large states. Each one of them had control over a section of Spain. They also had a large share of royal authority, corresponding to that of the dynasty they had divided up. They thus remained in power until the Almoravids, who shared in the strong Lamtuna group feeling, crossed the sea. The latter came and replaced and dislodged them from their centres. They obliterated all traces of the small princes who were unable to defend themselves because they had no longer any group feeling. And just to elaborate on this a bit more, so the Umayyads conquer Iberia, or most of it anyway, in the early 8th century. About 40 years later, when you have the Abbasid Revolution, the Umayyads are able to maintain control of Al-Andalus or Spain, and what they're able to do is establish their own independent emirate, which is nominally loyal to the caliph that's in Baghdad, but they're pretty much independent. About 200 years later, in the middle of the 10th century, you have the Emir Abdul Rahman III, who's considered the greatest of these rulers of Al-Andalus. He actually, in a direct challenge to the declining authority of the Abbasid caliphs, claims his own caliphate. He upgrades, if you like, the caliphate of the emirate of Cordoba to the caliphate of Cordoba. But less than 100 years after he does this, the caliphate is disintegrated and it breaks up into these network of taifas, or sort of Arabic Muslim microstates in Spain. And I think one of the problems of this is as Ibn Khaldun says, because you're so far away from the core Arab lands, the Umayyads are having to heavily rely on these tribal groups in North Africa, such as the Berbers and the Zanata. And what's also the problem is, because there's still a significant number of Christians living under them, again, the Christians don't really have any particular group feeling or kinship with the Muslims. So again, I think that's another problem, which leads to the breakdown over the long term. 3. Members of a royal family may be able to found a dynasty that can dispense with group feeling. This is because the group feeling in which a member of a royal family may have much power over nations and races, and the inhabitants of remote regions who support his power may be obedient to that family and submissive. So when such a person succeeds, leaving the seat of his rule and the home of his might, joins those inhabitants of remote regions, they adopt him, they support his rule and help him, they take care of establishing his dynasty on a firm basis, they hope that he will be confirmed in his family rights and take the power away from his kinsmen. They do not desire to share in any way in his rule, as they subject themselves to his group feeling and submit to the colouring of material superiority, firmly belonging to him and his people. They believe, as in an article of faith, in being obedient to him and his people. Were they to desire to share his rule with him or without him, the earth would be shaken. Again, that's another very interesting passage. So I'm not sure if a royal family can dispense with group feeling. I mean, just to give a bit of nuance, I mean, just to give a historical example that's not rooted in the Islamic world, just thinking of, say, an English dynasty like the Plantagenets, for example, obviously they come in after the Normans, and they're actually able to last a lot longer. And in fact, in English history, the Plantagenets, I believe, are actually the longest dynasty in English/British history. They ruled for nearly 300 years. And one of the reasons I think they're so successful compared to others is because the sense of Asabiyyah, because obviously with the Norman conquest, they're a French or very Francophone dynasty, and there's a real lack of, there's a feeling of enmity between the Saxons or the English and the Normans. So the Normans have their own group feeling amongst themselves as opposed to the Saxons, but as I think you have a shifting of the culture, I think the Normans themselves lose their group feeling, and that leads to their own decline. The Plantagenets come in, and again, there's still this sort of elite Francophone culture, because ultimately the court language of England would still be French up until the time of Edward III in the mid-14th century. I think ultimately what happens is, especially when you get to people such as Edward I, the Plantagenets, I think, start to almost embody a new kind of English culture. The Plantagenets go from being French to being English, and this, I think, engenders a stronger sense of Asabiyyah with their subjects. And I think this makes sense because by the time you get to Edward I, you've no longer got the Angevin Empire of someone like Henry II, who rules half of France. The only territory left is a rump of Aquitaine. Most of his possessions are England, or these other possessions like Wales he's conquered, or Scotland, which he's trying to subsume. Nathan Hood, the Plantagenets had Anglo-Saxon and Norman blood, so they combined both in their family. They literally embodied the New English. And no, thank you, I very much agree with that, Nathan Hood. Essentially, they're sort of fusing the two together, and no one was creating like a new Asabiyyah amongst this new culture. 4. Dynasties of wide power and large royal authority have their origin in religion based either on prophethood or on truthful propaganda. This is because royal authority results from superiority. Superiority results from group feeling. Only by God's help in establishing his religion do individual desires come together in agreement to press their claims and hearts become united. The secret of this is that when hearts succumb to false desires and are inclined toward the world, mutual jealousy and widespread differences arise. When they are turned toward the truth and reject the world and whatever is false and advance toward God, they become one in their outlook. Jealousy disappears, mutual cooperation and support flourish. As a result, the extent of the state widens and the dynasty grows, as we shall explain now. Yeah, prophethood or truthful propaganda. Again, I think this might be an issue to do with translation again, but this idea of prophethood, for those who don't know, I've been starting a series on the history of modern Iran, and I did a stream last week on Shah Ismail, the first Shah of the Safavid dynasty. And what's really interesting when looking at Ismail is how he's able to be so successful and found this new Iranian state in the early modern period. And there was a sense of Asabiyyah between him and his subjects in many different ways. With his Kizilbash, or these Turkic tribal warriors, there's an Asabiyyah because the Safavids being Sufis, the Kizilbash worship him as like a divine prophet. He's their perfect guide who would lead them to truth and paradise. So there's that aspect. There's also Ismail is creating a sense of Asabiyyah because by bringing in a load of these Arab Shia clergy, he wants to impose Shia Islam as a new national religion of Iran. And so ultimately, he's doing this because he wants to kind of create a distinct national character in the Islamic world for Iran against, the Ottoman Empire. And again, this is almost like another sense of it's a religious Asabiyyah. So again, these are just two aspects of how this can be implemented. What Ibn Khaldun's talking about. 5. Religious propaganda gives a dynasty at its beginning another power in addition to that of the group feeling it possessed as a result of the number of its supporters. As we have mentioned before, the reason for this is that religious colouring does away with mutual jealousy and envy among people who share in a group feeling and causes concentration upon the truth. When people come to have the right insight into their affairs, nothing can withstand them. Because their outlook is one and their object one of common accord, they are willing to die for their objectives. The members of the dynasty they attack may be many times as numerous as they, but their purposes differ, insomuch as they are false purposes, and the people of the worldly dynasty come to abandon each other since they are afraid of death. Therefore, they do not offer resistance to the people with religious colouring. Even if they themselves are more numerous, they are overpowered by them and quickly wiped out as a result of the luxury and humbleness existing among them, as we have mentioned before. This happened to the Arabs at the beginning of Islam during the Muslim conquests. The armies of Muslims at Al-Qadisiyah and at Yarmouk numbered some 30,000 in each case, while the Persian troops at Al-Qadisiyah numbered 120,000, and the numbers of Heraclius, according to Al-Waqidi, 400,000. Neither of the two parties was able to withstand the Arabs, who routed them and seized what they possessed. I'm going to come in here and say that I do think he is somewhat exaggerating the numbers a bit. I don't doubt the Arabs may have been outnumbered, but I don't think it would have been as comical as, like 10 to 1 at Yarmouk. I think they were much more, there was much more of an equilibrium in the numbers. What is more stunning about those two battles, Yarmouk was against the Byzantines and Al-Qadisiyah against the Persians, both in 636 AD, is you have this, these two great empires, the Byzantines and the Persians, they've just been suffered these defeats at the hands of the previously saw as these backwards, Bedouin tribes from the backwaters of the Arabian desert, and suddenly these people have surged out of their desert confines and defeated them in battle and then conquered their empires from them. I mean, you also see this later on, with the Turks, the Seljuks come in and conquer most of the Middle East, and then when they collapse, you have these many other Turkish dynasties. You've got the Mamluks who conquer, with the Ayyubids who conquer Egypt, and then the Mamluks after them. You then have the Ottomans, one of the most famous Islamic dynasties in history. Again, they were outnumbered a lot in a lot of their early battles. Right, okay. This can also be illustrated by the situation existing at the time. When the religious colouring changes and is destroyed, the power of the ruling dynasty is then wiped out. Superiority existed merely in proportion to the existing group feeling, without the additional power of religion. As a result, the dynasties overpowered by those groups up to this time, under its control, are equal or superior to it in strength. It had formerly overpowered the groups that had a stronger group feeling and were more deeply rooted in desert life, with the help of the additional power that religion had given it. Fundamentally, as the Arabs become more worldly as opposed to spiritual, then yes, that's certainly when the rot does set in. But even if we're looking at the contemporary West, as we've seen the decline of religion, the rise of secularization, I think that's a lot of where our moral woes and our civilizational issues are stemming from fundamentally. 6. Religious propaganda cannot materialize without group feeling. This is because every mass political undertaking by necessity requires group feeling. This is indicated in Muhammad saying, God sent no prophet who did not enjoy the protection of his people. If this was the case with the prophets, who are among them human beings, those most likely to perform wonders, one would expect it to apply, all the more so to others. One cannot expect them to be able to work the wonder of achieving superiority without group feeling. To this chapter belong cases of revolutionaries from among the common people and of jurists who undertake to reform evil practices. Many religious people who follow the ways of religion come to revolt against unjust emirs. Emir being an Islamic word for a independent sovereign or a prince, is a literal translation. They call for a change in and prohibition of evil practices. They hope for a divine reward for what they do. They gain many followers and sympathizers among the great mass of the people, but they risk being killed. And most of them actually do perish in consequence of their activities as sinners, unrewarded because God had not destined them for such activities. He commands such activities to be undertaken only where there exists the power to bring them to a successful conclusion. Muhammad said, should one of you see evil activities, he should change them with his hand. If he cannot do that, he should change them with his tongue. And if he cannot do that, he should change them with his heart. Rulers and dynasties are strongly entrenched. Their foundations can be undermined and destroyed only through strong efforts backed by the group feeling of tribes and families, as we've mentioned before. Similarly, prophets in their religious propaganda depended on groups and families, though they were the ones who could have been supported by God with anything in existence. If he had wished, but in his wisdom, he permitted matters to take the customary course. And it must go, but we'll check out the rest later. Thanks for great discussion, top work, friend. Well, thank you so much for stepping in and watching and commenting, Nathan C.J. Hood. And another example, I'm just thinking of reading this passage. I've recently read a biography of Oliver Cromwell, and I think you very much see this in the Protestant Reformation. A lot of the Puritans, especially the English Puritans, there was this kind of radical group feeling. The idea of John Fox's Book of Martyrs, and why do we have the English Civil War? Because the Puritans have this solidarity against the Stuart dynasty and the Anglican establishment, and you get its most radical form with someone like a Cromwell. He is this great, I don't want to say messianic, but this great sort of religious zealot who takes over the country and imposes his own will upon it. Again, there's a reason Spengler compares Cromwell to Muhammad in Decline of the West. And if people are more interested in discussion on that, myself and Hunger did discuss Spengler's segment from Volume 2 called Problems of Arabian Culture. That was from about a couple of years ago. The stream's called On Magian Civilization. Okay. There's a bit more. If someone who's on the right path were to attempt religious reforms in this way, his isolation would keep him from gaining the support of group feeling and he would perish. If someone merely pretends to achieve religious reforms in order to gain political leadership, he deserves to be hampered by obstacles and to fall victim to perdition. Religious reforms are a divine matter that materializes only with God's pleasure and support. Through sincere devotion to him, and in view of good intentions toward the Muslims, no Muslim, no person of insight could doubt this. Many deluded individuals took it upon themselves to establish the truth. They did not know that they would need group feeling for that. They did not realize how their enterprise must necessarily end and what they would come to. Towards such people, it is necessary to adopt one of the following courses. One may either treat them if they are insane, or one may punish them either by execution or beatings when they cause trouble, or one may ridicule them and treat them as buffoons. At the beginning of this century, a man known as Al-Abbas appeared among the Gumara, the lowest among the stupid and imbecile members of those tribes following his blethering. He marched on Badis, one of the Gumara cities, and entered it by force. He was then killed. 40 days after the start of his mission, he perished like those before him. There are many similar cases. Their mistake is that they disregard the significance of group feeling for success in such matters. If deceit is involved, it is better that such a person should not succeed to be made to pay for his crime. Again, the idea of the false prophet, and I can't help but think of certain populist leaders, like I don't know, like Nigel Farage. When I read a passage like this, I think a lot of us are realizing now what he really stands for, and any kind of solidarity or Asabiyyah between Nigel Farage and his followers, I think, is really starting to break down now. 7. Each dynasty has a certain amount of provinces and lands and no more. The reason for this is that group to which given a dynasty belongs and the people who support and establish it must of necessity be distributed over the provinces and border regions which they reach and take into possession. Only thus is it is popular to protect them against enemies and to enforce the laws of the dynasty relative to their collection of taxes, restrictions, and other things. When the various groups have spread over the border regions and provinces, their numbers are necessarily exhausted. This then is the time when the territory of the dynasty has reached its farthest extension, where the border regions form a belt around the centre of the realm. If the dynasty then undertakes to expand beyond its holdings, its widening territory remains without military protection and is laid open to any chance attack by enemy or neighbour. This has the detrimental result for the dynasty of the creation of boldness towards it and of diminished respect for it. If the group is a very large one and its numbers are not exhausted when distributed over border regions and territories, the dynasty retains the strength to go beyond the limit so far reached until its expansion has gone as far as possible. The natural reason for this situation lies in the fact that the power of the group feeling is one of the natural powers. Any power resulting in any kind of action must proceed in its action in such manner. A dynasty is stronger at its centre than it is at the border regions. When it has reached its farthest expansion, it becomes too weak and incapable to go any farther. This may be compared to light rays that spread from their centres, or to circles that widen over the surface of the water when something strikes it. When the dynasty becomes senile and weak, it begins to crumble at its extremities. The centre remains intact until God permits the destruction of the whole dynasty. Then the centre is destroyed, but when a dynasty is overrun from the centre, it is of no avail to it that the outlying areas remain intact and dissolves all at once. The centre is like the heart from which the vital spirit spreads. Were the heart to be overrun and captured, all the extremities would be routed. This may be observed in the Persian dynasty. Its centre was Al-Madain, or Ctesiphon. When the Muslims took over Al-Madain, the whole Persian Empire dissolved. Possession of the outlying provinces of the realm was of no avail to Yazdegerd. I mean, in fairness, I would argue the Sassanid defeat, rather, was more the fact that Yazdegerd just kept throwing Persian armies into open battle with the Arabs and kept getting them slaughtered, and to the point that the rest of the Persian aristocracy were just like, we're not going to keep supporting this. And, the whole war effort collapsed. But I do sort of see where Ibn Khaldun's coming from. Conversely, the centre of the Byzantine dynasty in Syria was in Constantinople. When the Muslims took Syria away from the Byzantines, the latter repaired to their centre in Constantinople. The loss of Syria did not harm them. They all continued there without interruption until God permitted it to be ended. Now, that's a very interesting explanation as to why the Byzantine Empire survived, whereas the Persian Empire didn't from the Arab conquest, because that's something that's always sort of been on my mind. And I somewhat see where it's coming from, but I'm still not fully convinced. Again, I just think it's because after these two battles that I mentioned before in 636, Battle of Al-Qatadir and the Battle of Yarmouk, Heraclius, after defeat, retreats back into Anatolia, and then plans to a reconquest at a later date. Whereas the Persians, though they retreat, they keep raising more armies to keep. They don't try and instead defend the vital mountain ways or pathways into Persia. They instead just keep fighting these open battles, and when the war effort collapses, the Arabs can just overrun the rest of the country. And that, to me, is probably a more compelling reason why I think the Persians were ultimately completely annexed, as opposed to the Byzantines limping on. Another example is the situation of the Arabs at the beginning of Islam. Since they were a very large group, they very quickly overran neighbouring Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. Then they penetrated Western India, as Sind, Abyssinia, Ifriqiya, and the Maghrib, and later Spain. Their numbers were exhausted by that expansion. No further conquest could be made by them, and the Muslim Empire reached its farthest extension. The situation of latter dynasties was the same. Each dynasty depended on the numerical strength of its supporters. When its numbers were exhausted through expansion, no further conquest or extension of power was possible. This is how God proceeds with his creatures. Now, again, fascinating. Again, my voice is starting to go, so I'm actually going to wrap that up there. Thank you for everybody who's watched and commented. I hope that's been a good summary of the concept of Asabiyyah, especially with how a people or a civilization can rise, and very much how it can break down and fall once an empire or kingdom has been established. Again, though he's very much talking in a Arabo-Islamic context, I think I brought up enough other examples, and if people can use their imagination, you can really see how I think this concept is universal. I think you can really use it to explain so much in many other civilizations and cultures outside of the Arab world or the Middle East. Okay, we have had a super chat on Entropy from Nami L. Carlson for $25 US. Great stream as usual. We'll have to finish later. The streams on Iran were especially good. Well, thank you so much, Nami L. Carlson. I really love your support, and you've always given to me on this channel. Top guy. Let me just refresh Entropy and make sure nothing else has come through. One moment. Oh, it's kept me out one moment. Okay. Yeah, no other super chats. Okay. Well, again, thank you again all so much for watching. I'm not sure what I'm going to be doing next Tuesday, but as Naomi Council mentioned, yes, I do have a Iran series, part one of that with Hunger, where we're going to be looking at the rise of the Safavids and the height of them up until around the time of the mid 17th century. That should be going up. We'll be streaming it, I believe, around the middle of April, God willing. But like the Ismail stream I did last week, I'm probably going to do a couple of other special streams on various aspects of Iranian history in conjunction with the main series. So look out for that as well. So thank you so much for watching, and good night.